Welcome, everyone, to Conversations with Thought Leaders. My name is Andrea Sampson. I'm the CEO and founder of Talk Boutique and the Thought Leader Academy. And today I am so incredibly honored and privileged to have my guest, Jeremy Miller. Jeremy is the founder of Sticky Branding. He's a best-selling author. He's of Sticky Branding and a keynote speaker. Sticky branding is a complete system to grow your business into a sticky brand. He teaches you how to make your business stand out, attract customers, and grow into a remarkable brand. Now, I've known Jeremy for a number of years, and Jeremy has sometimes a different point of view than anyone else I've ever met. Sometimes I like to call him a bit of a contrarian. And so I'm excited for this conversation. Jeremy, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Well, my pleasure, and thanks for inviting me, Andrea. It's so much fun to get to do this in live and streaming to everybody watching today.
I know it's really exciting. And, a shout out to everybody who is joining us here live. Thank you for joining us. And this is an interactive conversation. So make sure that if you have any questions, as Jeremy and I are just sort of ping ponging back and forth, drop them into the chat wherever you are watching us. And we will make sure to bring those up in our conversation. So that said, Jeremy, you and I have talked many, many times. And as we were preparing for this show, talking about the identity crisis of branding, what struck me was that you think it does have an identity crisis, and it was like, I've never really thought of it in that way. I spent many years in the world of branding, as I know you have. So tell me, how have you come to that viewpoint, and why is it important for others to know about it?
I love this question because I really do believe that branding as a profession has an identity crisis. And you can see it in the most simple ways of just look for a definition of what is brand or what is branding. And you will find that across thought leaders, there is not consistency of what is the definition of branding. And what often happens is the definition gets tied to someone's expertise. If somebody is in advertising, they will talk around ads and awareness and creative. If they're in, say, graphic design, they'll talk about consistency, colors, and those types of scenarios. If you're in experiential marketing, if you're in another specialization of marketing, it will carry a different weight and meaning. And so this is why I think it becomes so confusing for business owners and executives and CMOs to be talking about what does it mean to be working on their brand and branding, because it becomes this multifaceted and multifactorial conversation that has a lot of nuanced meanings. And so no wonder it's confusing that if everyone spins it in their own light, it actually means very little to the average company.
So with that, so like as I just hear you talk about that, and I talk a lot about branding through the lens of personal branding.
Mhm.
And when we think about thought leaders, because I that is my area of expertise these days, is really looking deeply into how thought leaders build their reputation in the market using a personal brand. How does that relate to the concept of branding and what you've just said, which is, okay, well, now you're putting something on top of it that says you must be this type of a brand or that type of a brand. So how does that play into it?
I really struggle with the concept of personal branding personally. The problem I have with personal brand, or the problem I have with personal branding versus branding. In branding, we are instilling both a strategy and personality onto a product or service or company for commercial needs. And if for some reason it doesn't work anymore, we can change it. So we change company names or product names regularly. ISIS Pharmaceuticals had to change their name because of the terrorist organization with the same name. So if something happens, we change it. And when we start thinking about personal branding, the problem I have with it is you and I and people in general are complex people. We're complex organisms with multiple levels of interest. But branding is served best when you are almost put into a caricature or distilled into
Mm.
being known for one thing or being known for something. And so how you craft that becomes a real struggle. But in very simple terms, when I think of the topic of personal branding, what are we really trying to do? Well, personal branding is this idea of amplifying yourself. So you have a personal brand. Everyone has a personal brand. You have a personal brand. I have one. In very simple terms, it's your reputation. You are known by your reputation. So when we talk about personal branding, what we're really saying is, how do we grow our reputation to say more people than we know in our personal network? So how do we create that amplification to reach hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of people through our content, through our work, through our expertise? But the personal branding tactics, if we take business practices and apply them to ourselves, we actually can restrict a person, and that dishonors or discredits how interesting they truly can be.
Mm. Interesting. Like, so what I just heard you say was, in order to be a personal brand, first of all, you use your reputation, which makes total sense, right? Who I am, how I show up in the world, it precedes me, that reputation. Um, but the other thing I heard you say was that we're multifaceted,
Yes.
which is true. Now, when I'm working with thought leaders, the thing that I'm doing with them is I am creating a consistent and clear approach to what they are putting out in the world so that it's consistent. Now,
Mm.
that's not to say that they're not multifaceted, they absolutely are. However, we always go through the lens of a what, how, and a why, and the why being one of the most important things, the impact that you're creating in the world. And thought leadership is often built on top of the impact that you're creating, because it's the why you do the thing you do. No matter what you do, no matter where you are in the world, there's a why that you have. That, for me, I'm always about creating a future that's better than the present we have. That is, from it, as I now have established my own personal brand, and I start looking back and I realize it was the reason I got into advertising. It was the reason I got into fundraising. It was the reason that I did everything I've done in my life. I didn't know it. I didn't know that about myself until probably the last 10 years. But it was through the work of building out my brand that I was really able to make those connections. So that is where I see the consistency lives. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as you've heard that and go, okay, does that change your mind at all? Or does that give you a new way to see personal branding?
I think you're adding a very deep and rich layer to the conversation. So, as somebody's getting into personal branding, being able to go through an exercise of self discovery, knowing yourself, knowing your passions, knowing your purpose or your why, allows you to be more authentic and more interesting. It also provides you a compass to help navigate to the topics that you are trying to do. But I also think this is where starts to take the leap for me, is that why also has to typically have a commercial piece to this. And
Mm,
that's where those boundaries or those restrictions come up, because you can have a truly purpose driven personal brand. And I think that's actually really wonderful, because that self discovery allows you to be a happier, more fulfilled person, as well as a more interesting person. But then how are you going to apply this? I'll
right.
give you a very interesting correlation. I read a research study a few years ago that was discussing church leaders, religious figures. And in the US, it's a far more commercially driven business than it is elsewhere in the world. You can have very
Yes.
wealthy pastors, but in their personal branding journeys, they become known for one thing. So some might be more known for leadership than where someone else is known for money and wealth and say personal finances. The person who has expertise in and put a third category, let's say marriages and family couples, leadership and say personal finances. The individual might have expertise in all three areas, but they end up having to go really deep in their one niche in order to amplify their personal brand, to be known for that thing. And so this is that commercial side of your why, is how are you using your personal
Mhm.
brand, whether it's for career gain, for monetization, for spreading the gospel, whatever it is, there's usually some form of commercial intent to this. So that personal, that self-awareness, I believe, is the foundation. You can't do anything else without it. But then you start to come out to these other pieces, and that's where that narrowing starts to impact you.
Mhm. Yeah, and back when I was a brand strategist, I mean, one of the things we used to say a lot of times was a brand is an empty vessel. It's what you put inside of it, right?
Mm,
And so to your point, when we're working with corporate brands, our business brands, often there is nothing that you're starting with. I mean, they have a business, they have something they do, but they don't have anything that they're known for yet. And so that's what branding does, is it takes all the bits and pieces and it compiles them in a way that is accessible to the external world so that they stand for something and that they offer something in a way that we align to. And, I used to work for the agency that did the Apple work. And I remember looking at some of the early days of the Apple brand and, and why it was created and how it was created. And
mm,
it was, fascinating to see the build out of something called Apple, which was a computer that had no connection at all to computers, to becoming initially creative tools for creative people, which
right.
then turned into what we know Apple to be today. And so it was imbuing this sense of creativity within this brand that had nothing to do with creativity at the time, because computers in those days were gray boxes that sat on desktops that
Mhm.
developers used. So, the imbuing of a brand with a personality, with a meaning, with a purpose is key. And as a person, looking at the way in which I use my brand, I mean, my expression of who I am into what I do has been both an evolution, but also an intentional practice. Because to your point, it has to be the connection of why you do what you do, and the thing you do has got to be relevant and evident to everybody who meets it. So when you think about the branding aspect
Mhm.
and then the commercialization of the brand, how do we get it? Is branding a sales tool? And then specifically, like if I'm a personal brand, does that make me a product that I'm selling? Because I think there's, a big question there. So is branding the same as selling? And if they are, then what happens with a personal brand?
Right. And these are the conflicts that we kind of come into. So I have two pieces here I'd like to hit on. So the first one is, let's break down the definition between brand and branding, because I think they're actually separate topics. For
I agree.
brand, the definition I rely on the most often is Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon's definition. He said, "Your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room." And I love that. It's a reputation piece. And when you look at that, whether that's personal branding or corporate branding, that's a lagging indicator. That's based on the work you have done, which shapes your reputation. If we look at this through corporate, if you've got a fast moving startup, the work you've done can actually be out of date. So your brand is in a constant state of catch up because you're doing new work constantly, which becomes something that you're trying to catch up to. So that really takes us to where branding is. Branding to me is the strategy of how you want to influence that reputation, whether that's
Mm.
corporate or individual. So personal branding or business branding is around, how do you have a strategy to grow, to innovate, to shape the narrative or the actual business to what you're trying to do. My lens when it comes, or I'll come to that in a second. One of the things on the personal branding front, and even on the business branding front, is the best way to affect your brand isn't through your colors or your website, it's through your body of work. And so you take the Apple example, they have been such brilliant, focused executors for decades, and they've outlived all of their competitors because of that discipline of execution. And you watch their events, they are so consistently focused. Where if we look at Samsung or another brand, they're always all over the place. So you never actually remember what they talked about. So execution becomes a really big piece. In personal branding, it's your body of work. This is a term that comes from Pamela Slim. She wrote Escape Cubicle Nation originally, and she's one of her more recent books is called Body of Work. And if you look at the content and thought leadership an individual creates, the actual work they've done, the results they've done, whether that's in their career, in their service, in their books, in their content, their speaking. What you create is your body of work. And that execution is also what drives your brand. That's what shapes that lagging indicator is the work you have done.
Mm.
So when you're branding, you're trying to say, what are we going to do next? And then being relentless on executing towards that.
I think it's really interesting. So what you're saying is your products influence your brand because those products themselves are in fact the child of the brand. And we meet often the product before we meet the brand. So therefore, there's a big influence on how. So if the product is good, we have a favorable perception of the brand. But if for whatever reason the product doesn't work in the way that we thought it would, or we have a bad experience with it, we now have a bad perception of the brand.
Right. Your brand ultimately, that's such a great delineation on this. So you asked earlier, is your brand about sales? And the answer is yes, but more. So a good measure of success on your brand is if your brand doesn't sell, it's not working. But the other part of it is if you're not delivering what your products and services are supposed to deliver, it's also not working. So where most people shape an opinion of a brand isn't from the marketing or advertising, it's from the actual use of the product or service. You might be aware of every brand of car, but it's the car you drive is the car you know. And if you love it and you go back, if you're a Ford person or a Tesla person, you have that brand loyalty, it's because you're a user of the product. And so how you deliver is ultimately what people are consuming. And that again, that's on both the personal branding side and on the business branding side. In the business side, we are selling products and services that are consumed and used to solve actual problems or needs. In the personal branding side, it's very similar, but the product or service is you.
It's me. Yeah. And Roger Thorpe, who's listening, had a question. He says, does your brand, personal or business, end up being shaped by the type of clients or connections that you attract? Your brand is what your clients see and know best. And I think this is a really interesting. So it's like, is your brand defined by who works with you, or do you attract them and therefore that becomes your brand? It's like, which is first, the chicken or the egg?
I think they're probably tied both together. And Raj,
Yeah.
thanks for the question because I think Roger is the CEO of Thorpe Benefits, and they're a phenomenal brand in the benefits consulting world, and we're checking out because they tie wellness into their insurance services, and so. Using what I know of that business, I'll try to answer it back in that your ability to serve a group brilliantly is part of how you deliver value. You can't be all things to all people. Even Walmart and Amazon, who are these giant stores that serve very broad markets, have their own areas of specialization and niche where they are known for being something. So Amazon is the everything store focused on online, whereas Walmart is everyday low prices and they have their specific types of customers. So who you serve brilliantly and being able to tailor your products and services to that are 100%. It's that infinity loop of what you're trying to create in your overall reputation.
Well, and I would just extend that and say that, who you are as a brand, so whether you're a corporate brand or a personal brand, really does end up influencing who you attract,
Sure.
right? So when you show up as everyday low prices, well, who you attract are those who want everyday low prices. Now, do you get people who are just coming in to shop? Of course you do, but the primary audience you're attracting in is exactly that, because that's what we do with brands. We use them as attractors to who we want to bring in, and we can be intentional about that. And coming back to your earlier comments around brands changing over time,
Mm,
right? That absolutely happens because our clients change. So we start to notice that the clients that we're bringing in are of a certain, you know, need or process. And so we refine our brand to
right.
be more like that so that we bring in more of those. Or we notice that we're getting clients we don't want. So we change how we look and feel and show up so that we get less of that. And our brand can do that. Because again, that comes back to the empty vessel.
Mm.
I mean, I think it's such a fascinating conversation. When I was in the branding world, well, before I was in the branding world, I worked in direct marketing for a good part of my career. And we used to always sort of look a little, less favorably at the branding people because we always thought they had it easy. We were doing the hard work of selling the product and they were doing the work of creating these beautiful brands. But the reality was that there was a direct relationship between these two things, selling and branding, right? And what we knew as direct marketing experts as we put a campaign out in the market was that if that product was not associated with the known brand, our response rates would be depressed. They absolutely would be. But if that product was sponsored by a brand that was known in the marketplace and that brand was active in their advertising, we would get a lift from it.
Right.
And so we knew that, right? So branding does have and has a direct monetary effect on sales. But what is the impact of a brand that, isn't yet known in the market and needs to actually sell? So is it the product that you brand and rely on that, or do you spend your money and your time and your effort on the corporate brand or the personal brand?
I'll give you the consultant answer. It depends. All of
Yeah.
those are viable tactics depending on what the situation is. If you think of it, that Steve Jobs or Sir Richard Branson have been incredible spokespeople for the companies that they represented, and they personified the brands. In other cases, the product speaks for itself. Look what BlackBerry was to Research in Motion. So you have different stories and different scenarios. You just gave another example of endorser brands. So GAF is a manufacturer of roofing tiles. So roofing contractors will be certified as master GAF roofing contractors or master certified GAF contractors. And the GAF brand supports them and differentiates them from other contractors who may have no true differentiators. It's
Right.
an industry with very low barriers to entry. We buy Kellogg's Corn Flakes, another example of an endorser brand. All of these are strategies, or all of these, I should say, are tactics. This is where that why question always comes back to me: is what are you trying to achieve and why, so that you can then look backwards to all the options. The thing that's so interesting about branding is it's about tilting the odds in your favor. How do you change the rules or the dynamics of the playing field so that you stand out? So if you just keep copying what everybody else is doing, you're going to be just another also than type of company or individual. It's in exceptionalism within defined areas of specialization that allow people to rise up and to have reputations that seem disproportionate to who they are.
Right. Well, I think this plays into the next question we've got from Jim Barnett, who's
Mm.
asking, so is branding your proactive leading activities to influence your company's perception in the market, and brand is your ability to live up to that perception?
Ooh, that's a good question. I want to hear what you
I
say to
know.
that, Jim, first.
Well, I mean, so is branding your proactive leading activities? You know, it is like I'm like really thinking about that. Again, this is the what comes first, right? So I think that it is. I do. I actually think it is. I think, it's your influence in the market is your brand. And then you need to live up to that. You're promising something, you're putting it out there, you're making a promise. In fact, again, when I worked in branding, that was one of the things that we would always, make sure we had. What is the promise we're making to the market? Now,
Mhm.
we may not be living up to that promise yet because maybe we're a new brand. Maybe we're just out in the market. Maybe it's what we want is an aspirational promise. But how do we live up to that? That's the question. And I think so few brands live up to their own promise. We see that through customer service. How many of us have been on, heard about how great a brand is, and then something goes wrong. And instead of being blown away by what what could be, we suddenly will never use that brand again. I think many of us have had that experience with telcos, as an example. I won't say any brands here, but I think that we all experience, that interruption of promise to delivery. What's your thoughts?
I agree with this, and I'll answer it from a slightly different angle. One of the things that in Siggy Branding we do advisory consulting on how do you grow your business and brand to the next level, and we often get into conversations around content marketing or social media marketing. And one of the things we often say is strategy comes second, that we will advise creating a content stream, whether that's posting once a week on LinkedIn or a monthly email newsletter or doing a live like we're doing right now. And getting started and having a habit is actually more important, and having a pub schedule, actually getting your work into the world. And then once you have that habit or that ritual, and it doesn't have to be very long, let's say just a few cycles, then you can start having data and experiences to start getting better at it. And I compare this analogy to, say, uh, going to the gym or losing weight. It's one thing to read every blog post you could ever find online and watching every single reel and TikTok. It's a whole other thing to go into the gym and just start doing it, and then tweaking and improving as you learn. So
Right.
I do believe it, if I understand the question fully from Jim, and I really think it's a good one, is you got to do the work in order to create the opportunity to be strategic, is the first part of it. And then as you're doing the work, you're saying to the world, this is what I will promise to you, and you better live up to it, because dissonance or letdowns will destroy all the good work that you've done on it. There's another metaphor. Have you heard the idea of making deposits in the trust bank?
Absolutely, the Stephen Covey and the emotional bank account, of course, absolutely.
So when I read Jim's comment, that's what I think of, is that what we're doing in our marketing is making deposits in the trust bank. And then if we screw up, are we going into a withdrawal, an overdraft? What's the
Yeah.
state of the reputation that allows you to weather mistakes? Because every company makes mistakes. The challenge is, how detrimental will they be to you?
Absolutely. And what, as I was listening to you, um, what was coming up for me is that when we're looking at any form of whether it's branding or campaign, and that's where you were kind of getting into it, was like, do the work first and then figure out what works second. And really, I think what we're talking about there is you got to build your reputation.
Yeah.
Like, you got to get out there and be who it is you want to be, whether you're a personal brand or a business brand. Show up being what it is you're promising. Be that thing. And don't just say you're that thing, but show up being that thing. And then notice if anyone actually wants that thing in the market. If they do, you're on to something. And then you should go deeper. But if you're not getting any response, maybe you need to start thinking about how you're showing up, because perhaps you've missed something, and maybe you need to ask your customers what they really want.
That's so inspirational. And if you watch TikTok or Instagram Reels right now, you can see that happening in real time, where someone puts out an interesting piece of content, something funny, whatever it is, and they get a bunch of reactions. So they do more of it, and they do more of it, and they become consistent, become known for that. And it doesn't take a lot for someone to become really famous really quickly, just by being consistent. But the thing is, and I think I love what you just said, is it takes the first step. If you don't actually create the content, if you don't hit the publish button, it doesn't matter. It's not until you're in the game that you're actually influencing and growing your brand. And that's really specific to the personal branding side, is you've got to be hitting publish to have a true impact.
Absolutely. It's funny. I did a thought of the day yesterday on the difference between an influencer and a thought leader.
Mm.
And that was actually the difference, is that, both influencers and thought leaders show up with their influence, and ultimately they want to make money from the thing they're doing. But the difference usually with influencers is the impact that they want to create.
Mm.
Thought leaders come into it with a purpose-based approach, Whereas influencers are often commercial, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's not, I'm not calling out influencers. I think it's a great career choice, but they're not looking to change the world, where that's often the difference between a thought leader and an influencer. And so it's an interesting point that you just made, which is you've got to be consistent, you've got to show up, you've got to hit publish a lot, and you've got to just find the thing that is going to work for you.
Mhm.
And then you can actually create some impact in the world.
I love that.
Jeremy, this has been fantastic. We're at time, and I want to be respectful. So thank you for joining me. This has been a really fascinating conversation. Is there any last words you want to leave everyone with, and how can we keep in touch with you?
Sure. I love where we've taken this conversation. So thank you so much for today, Andrea. The way I grew my personal brand was through an email newsletter and publishing every single week. So if you'd like to see that in real time, I encourage you visit stickybranding.com. You can sign up for it and see what I've been doing for the last 15 years, which has grown the Sticky Branding brand and led to my books and other things. So the easiest way to find me is just Google Sticky Branding, the website stickybranding.com. I'm on all the socials at Sticky Branding. And if you have any questions or anything else, feel free to send me a direct message on any of the platforms.
Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you, everyone who joined us today. We've had an amazing conversation. Make sure to check back here in a couple of weeks. We will be back with another guest talking about thought leadership and the way in which it is playing out in the market today. Thank you again. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. And Jeremy, thank you again. Take
Thank
care.
you.